Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the EME's Knowledge Series 2021. This afternoon, we'll be addressing the topic, Newly Enacted Waste Management Rules 2021. Our presentation will be conducted by Ms. Giselle Joseph, who is the Assistant Manager of the Noise, Air, and Waste Units. And during the question and answer period, Giselle will be assisted by Ms. Trisha Bijay, who is a technical officer in the waste unit. But before I invite Giselle to conduct her presentation, we have a few housekeeping matters that I'd like to share with you. First of all, we are live on Facebook as well as on Twitter. And we will also have a link to our YouTube channel, which will be on a little later. So we encourage you, please, to share these links with your networks, your stakeholders, and everyone who might be interested in sharing and listening to what we've had to say this afternoon. We are going to be just 1 hour, so we're finishing exactly at 3. And I know the number of questions, particularly since this is a new piece of legislation, we will not be able to entertain all the questions. However, we have a dedicated EMA email address, which I've put in the chat box. That is emawebinars@ema.co.tt. And I encourage you to please send any questions, any queries, concerns, or any feedback whatsoever on the presentation. So I will now turn you over or invite Giselle to begin her presentation. Giselle, welcome.
The EMA is pleased to present an overview of the Waste Management Rules 2021 and the Waste Management Fees Regulations 2021. In this presentation, we will explain the history and objectives of the rules, define the waste regulated under the rules, define persons, premises, and activities regulated by the rules, explain the various processes under the rules, and explain the fees payable under the rules. The Waste Management Rules and the associated Waste Management Fees Regulations apply to the management of waste except radioactive waste, set out a permitting system for persons generating waste at or above specified quantities and or handling waste at any quantity, and set out provisions that exempts specific persons, activities, and waste. The rules and fees regulations were informed by previous versions of the draft legislation and were finalized in May 2021. The rules and fees regulations were signed by the Minister of Planning and Development on June 14, 2021. Between June 14th and July 5th, the legislation was published in the Gazette and laid in Parliament for negative resolution before the declaration. However, the legislation takes effect on May 31st, 2022. This means that the requirements and processes under the legislation begin on May 31st, 2022. The rules and fees regulations are intended to improve how we manage and regulate waste in Trinidad and Tobago. Some of the benefits are to incentivize waste minimization and the environmentally sound management of waste. This will be done through the fees regulations, where the fees payable vary by the size of the enterprise and the types and quantities of waste generated or handled. The exemption from a waste handling permit if a person handles or intends to handle only waste generated on premises owned or occupied by the same person. The requirement for permit holders to establish a policy of insurance for the life of the permit for liabilities arising from major incidents and restorative or rehabilitative work while the permit is in effect. To reduce illegal dumping by mandating a waste manifest system to track the transportation and movement of waste from source to its ultimate destination, and to promote and encourage measures for waste minimization under duties assigned to the EMA. The rules define waste as having the meaning assigned to it in Section 2 of the Environmental Management Act and includes the waste listed in Schedule 1. This means that the term waste refers to the definition in the Act as shown on the slide and is further defined by the waste listed in Schedule 1 of the rules. Note that the definition in the Act refers to any material discarded or intended to be discarded as waste. Therefore, any waste listed in Schedule 1 of the rules that is discarded or intended to be discarded is considered waste. The rules also define hazardous waste and non-hazardous waste based on Schedules 1 and 2 in the rules. The types and quantities of waste in Schedule 1 and the criteria defined in Schedule 2 were based on the waste categories and quantities examined in the EMA's 2013 to 2015 Waste Inventory, the United Nations Basel Convention, the World Health Organization, and the following jurisdictions: Canada, the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, since they have well-established legislation for waste management. Schedule 1 lists the types and quantities of waste to be controlled by the rules. Persons generating waste at or above the quantities stated in Schedule 1 in a calendar year are required to apply for a waste generation permit. The quantities are not applicable to persons handling waste, that is, persons accepting waste from others for treatment, recovery, or disposal. This is because any person who accepts waste of any quantity for handling is required to apply for a waste handling permit. We will explain the permitting processes for both permits in later slides. Schedule 2 lists the hazardous criteria that will determine whether a waste in Schedule 1 is indeed hazardous. Table 1 defines waste thresholds. A waste is hazardous when it contains, consists of, or is contaminated with any substance at or above the quantity specified for the substance in Table 1. Table 2 defines hazardous characteristics. A waste is hazardous when it possesses any quality in Table 2. In general, a waste in Schedule 1 may be non-hazardous. However, if the waste in Schedule 1 exhibits any of the criteria in Schedule 2, then the waste is considered hazardous. Each piece of legislation implemented by the EMA includes definitions of terms used in the legislation, and the rules are no different. Some key terms in the rules which we will use throughout the presentation include generation, which is the production of waste from a process; handling, which is the acceptance of waste produced by another person for collection, storage, processing, treatment, recovery, recycling, or disposal; a permit holder, who is a person granted a waste generation permit or a waste handling permit; a generator, who is a permit holder that produces waste at such quantities which require a waste generation permit; a handler, who is a permit holder that receives waste from another person for handling and requires a waste handling permit; and environmentally sound management, or ESM, which means taking all practicable steps to ensure that waste is managed in a manner which will protect human health and the environment against adverse effects from waste. The rules also include obligations for both permit holders and the EMA. Regardless of the enterprise size and the types and quantities of waste generated and/or handled, there is a duty of care for all generators and handlers under Rule 3, namely compliance with the Environmental Management Act, the implementation of measures to manage waste in an environmentally sound manner, the segregation of hazardous waste from non-hazardous waste to support the safe handling of waste, the prevention of dilution as a substitute for the treatment of hazardous waste, and the treatment, recovery, or disposal of waste at facilities regulated under the rules. The EMA is obliged under Rule 44 to establish mechanisms to encourage waste minimization, which will further support the mandate of the EMA under the EM Act, including establishing waste prevention programs, plans, or measures, encouraging generators and handlers to rethink, reuse, reduce, and recycle waste, providing technical guidance to generators and handlers and other interested groups or persons, establishing cooperation with local authorities and private sector businesses on waste management practices, including actions that make waste recycling easier, and carrying out research aimed at promoting the use of innovative ideas or technology for recycling and waste collection from households. In both Rules 3 and 44, the EMA may take additional measures as it may determine. The rules recognize that certain persons, premises, and activities should be exempted from regulation because their wastes are regulated or handled by other governmental entities or may be better controlled through incentives. Under Rule 47.1, specific persons and premises are not required to obtain a permit as shown on the slide. However, they are obligated to ensure that their waste is handled by a permit holder. There may be instances where the person or premises may require a permit, but these will be examined on a case-by-case basis. For example, a household which conducts a business that produces waste may require a permit because the house is not solely or wholly used as a living accommodation. In this regard, we advise the exempted persons and owners or operators of the premises shown on the slide to contact the EMA for clarification should the need arise. As previously mentioned, there are also exempted activities under the rules as they relate to the types of waste generated, waste transport, and waste handling. For instance, persons producing gaseous emissions and wastewater from wastewater treatment premises are controlled under the EMA's Air Pollution Rules 2014 and Water Pollution Rules 2019 respectively. However, if the waste is accepted by another person for treatment, recovery, or disposal, that person should have a waste handling permit under the rules. Waste transport is not heavily regulated under the rules because other legislation exists to regulate vehicles in Trinidad and Tobago. However, all transporters, minus the exempted persons and activities, are expected to observe the waste manifest requirements under Rule 34, which we will explain in a later slide. The rules state that persons who only transport waste on or behalf of the municipal corporations or the Tobago House of Assembly are exempted from a permit. This is because arrangements under these governmental entities already exist for municipal waste collection. Therefore, the EMA would instead focus on ensuring that handlers who provide waste transport services also have insurance certificates for the vehicles used to transport waste. With respect to waste handling, Rule 11.5 exempts persons from a waste handling permit if they handled only their waste on premises owned or occupied by them. The rule exempts persons who store waste which was generated on their premises pending removal and disposal by a third party, only recover or recycle waste generated on their premises for use in any process on premises owned or occupied by them. Only disposes of waste generated on their premises without the need for further treatment by another person. While exempted activities exist, it is advised that the EMA be contacted for clarification where necessary, as the exemptions may vary based on the scope of the activity. Before we explore each process in the rules in more detail, we will provide an overview of the processes under three broad categories. Permit applications. There are two main permitting processes, the waste generation permit and waste handling permit, which we will explain in the following slide. Permit modifications, where the status of a permit may change or require change by the permit holder, the EMA, or both during the permitted period. These include permit variation, transfer, suspension, revocation, surrender, and cancellation. Post-permit activities, which are requirements following the issue of a permit, such as waste manifest, packaging of waste, record keeping, annual report, and a policy of insurance. The processes for violations and appeals are also addressed under the rules, where Rule 45 states that a violation is a breach of the rules which shall be considered a breach of an environmental requirement enforceable under the EM Act. Rule 46 allows persons to appeal decisions made by the EMA by writing to the Environmental Commission within 28 days of the EMA's decision. As previously stated, there are two main permitting processes under the rules. The Waste Generation Permit, or WGP, which applies to persons who produce waste at or above the quantities specified in Schedule 1, unless the waste is hazardous, which requires a permit at any quantity. The Waste Handling Permit, or WHP, which applies to persons who accept waste from other persons for management, such as collection, storage, processing, treatment, recovery, recycling, or disposal. A waste handling permit is required if a person accepts waste at any quantity for handling. Some persons may have another permit from the EMA, known as a Certificate of Environmental Clearance, or CEC, that may address the handling of waste. However, CEC holders would still be required to apply for a waste handling permit to allow persons to be recorded on the waste permit register under the rules. The EMA will determine the extent to which a waste handling permit may apply, and the conditions under the permit may be significantly reduced if they are already covered under a CEC. We advise CEC holders to consult with the EMA for clarification. If you are an entity existing and operating on or before May 31st, 2022, when the rules come into operation, then a waste generation permit application is required within 60 working days starting May 31st, 2022, and a waste handling permit application is required within 90 working days starting May 31st, 2022. If you are an entity who will start producing waste after May 31st, 2022, then a waste generation permit application is required at least 40 working days before the start of operations, that is, before starting to produce waste, and a waste handling permit application is required at least 60 working days before the start of operations. The application forms will be published by the EMA during the first quarter of 2022. However, the rule states information which will be included in applications. The application processes for a waste generation permit and a waste handling permit are similar, where both processes have the same processing time for the EMA to acknowledge an application, that is, 20 working days. Both processes allow the EMA to request further information or clarification if needed, and for the applicant to submit the information in a time specified by the EMA, or to request an extended time to submit the information. Both processes have the same processing time for the EMA to issue a permit or issue a notice indicating the proposed action to refuse a permit. Both processes require the EMA to provide reasons for the proposed action to refuse a permit and to allow the applicant at least 10 working days to respond to the proposed action. And both permits are valid for 3 years from the date of issue and may be renewed once the criteria for same are met. If a renewed permit is required, applications for renewal are required at least 30 working days prior to expiration, but the permit remains valid until a determination is made. A permit is no longer required when the criteria for same no longer applies. Applicants for a permit may, under Rule 39, request the omission of information deemed a trade secret or confidential business information in a permit application from the Waste Permit Register, which will be discussed later in the presentation. The EMA may refuse the request if it determines that the applicant has not disclosed the basis for the request, the basis of the request is invalid, or the interest of the public in disclosing the information outweighs the prejudice to the applicant. However, the EMA may uphold the claim if the EMA has no objection to the claim or the EMA rejected the claim but the applicant appeals to the Environmental Commission, who advises that the claim be upheld. A proposed action is a determination made by the EMA to proceed with an action regarding the refusal of a permit application, the refusal of a permit variation or transfer of an application, the decision to vary, suspend, or revoke a permit on its own initiative. The EMA shall provide persons the opportunity to be heard under Rule 33, where the EMA issues a notification of the proposed action with reasons for same and allows at least 10 working days for written submissions to be provided to the EMA on the proposed action. Note that the EMA may refuse an applicant or permit holder if the permit issue or modification would not be in the interest of the public, there is false, materially misleading, or inadequate information, or any false or materially misleading representation. The person is not a fit and proper person, or any such reason the EMA thinks fit. The EMA is obligated under Rule 33 to review the written submissions before maintaining or withdrawing its decision. A permit may be varied by the permit holder or by the EMA on its own initiative if there is a modification, addition, or removal of a process which will increase the quantity of waste generated or handled, add a new waste which is not covered by the permit, or change the characteristics of the waste generated or handled. If the EMA determines that a variation may be required because it was made aware that the conditions for a variation occurred or will occur, the EMA is required to notify the permit holder of its reasons to vary the permit, allow the permit holder to make submissions, and then vary the permit if needed. If the permit holder determines that a variation may be required, the permit holder is required to apply for the variation by form and payment of a fee at least 45 working days before the variation is intended to be implemented, and receive the varied permit before proceeding with the variation. The application periods are similar to the waste generation permit and waste handling permit processing times, with 20 working days for acknowledgement and 20 working days to issue the varied permit. If the EMA determines that an application for a variation should be refused, the EMA shall notify the permit holder of the proposed action, allow the permit holder to make submissions, and then determine whether to issue or refuse the permit variation. A permit may be transferred following application and approval from the EMA. Once an application is made, the EMA will, within 20 working days, transfer or refuse to transfer the permit subject to Rule 33. The persons involved in a transfer, existing and new permit holders, are bound by the following. The new permit holder cannot possess the premises until the transfer is approved. The permit conditions are binding on the new permit holder. The EMA may vary or incorporate permit conditions as necessary. If the new permit holder wishes to change existing permit conditions, an application for a variation would be required. A permit may be suspended by the EMA where there is a breach of a material condition, that is, a condition which has specific relevance or significance to an activity, or it is necessary to facilitate emergency response activities under the EM Act. That is, whenever the EMA reasonably believes that a release or potential release presents a threat to human health or the environment, and undertakes emergency response activities including the following after consultation with the Minister and in coordination with other appropriate governmental entities. The remediation or restoration of environmentally degraded sites, the containment of any waste, hazardous substances, or environmentally dangerous conditions, and such other appropriate measures as may be necessary to prevent or mitigate adverse effects on human health or the environment. A permit shall be revoked under Rule 31 if the EMA determines that the permit holder becomes a person of unsound mind, is unable, unfit, or unwilling to perform his functions, is in breach of a material term or condition of the permit, dies, becomes bankrupt, goes into liquidation or receivership, or becomes a party to an amalgamation. However, under Rule 31, the EMA is required to consider the interests of the public before a permit is revoked. In such cases where the interest of the public is significant, the EMA could either suspend, vary, or transfer the permit. The surrender of a permit applies when a permit holder ceases or intends to cease the generation or handling of waste. Approval from the EMA is required for the surrender of a permit, and an application for same shall be made on the approved form, which will request information on a description of the types and characteristics of waste on the premises, a description of the measures implemented to properly dispose of the waste on the premises, including its conveyance to another person with a valid permit, and such other information as the EMA may determine. The EMA will approve the surrender once the permit holder demonstrates that all waste from the premises have been handled in an environmentally sound manner. Once approved, the EMA notifies the permit holder to deliver the permit to the EMA, and the EMA cancels the permit. The rules require all persons involved in the movement of waste to ensure that waste is tracked from source to destination and that it is packaged to prevent any spills or releases during transportation. A manifest is a record which tracks the movement of waste from its source to its ultimate destination. Other common terms for a waste manifest include consignment notes or chain of custody. Packaging refers to the material used to contain waste, noting that inappropriate materials or physical damage could result in leaks and emissions during handling. The rules require generators to prepare the manifest, since generators are responsible for tracking waste to its destination. However, this does not prevent others from implementing a manifest system, and if some persons already operate a system which effectively tracks waste collected for management. The rules also list the information which must be included in a manifest, but does not limit the EMA nor the public to the information stated. The EMA may add such other information as appropriate in permits or advise on same in guidelines. A permit holder is also free to add information which may be necessary for its internal procedures. Rule 36 requires generators and handlers to package waste to prevent any leakage or emission under normal transportation conditions or potentially dangerous transportation conditions, and properly label and mark waste to identify the hazardous characteristics and dangers associated with its transportation. The EMA may outline packaging requirements in permits or publish guidelines which may refer to internationally accepted standards and best practices. The EMA is required to establish and maintain a waste permit register, which will include details on applications, decisions, notices, and such other information that the EMA may deem necessary. The EMA shall allow public inspection during business hours at EMA offices or at any time on its online version. Extracts may be requested by application and payment of the prescribed fee. Rule 41 requires permit holders to make and maintain records as determined by the EMA. Records may comprise waste management plans, inspections, sampling, and analysis. However, the records will be prescribed in permits. The records shall also be maintained for at least 6 years after a permit expires, or as otherwise prescribed by the EMA. Records may be maintained digitally or in hard copy, at the discretion of the permit holder. Note that the EMA is moving towards digital records, and such records will be accepted by the EMA as well. Rule 42 requires permit holders to establish a policy of insurance during the life of the permit to cover liabilities associated with waste generation and handling. The intention is for permit holders to have financial resources available to address any incidents associated with waste generation and handling, and incentivize the environmentally sound management of waste as far as practicable to prevent the use of the policy of insurance. Rule 43 requires permit holders to submit an annual report to the EMA within 30 days of the anniversary date of the permit from the date of issue. The EMA will provide guidance on the format of the report and such other information required. However, the rule requires permit holders to report information such as the types, characteristics, and quantities of waste generated or handled, the method of treatment, recovery, or disposal for each type of waste generated or handled, a list of transporters of waste used, a description of spills, releases, or any incidents arising from waste generation or handling, and a description of measures implemented to reduce the hazardous characteristics or quantities of waste generated during the reporting period. Now we move on to the Waste Management Fees Regulations. The Fees Regulations is comprised of 4 schedules. Schedule 1 considered the enterprise size category or ESC of the applicant, which are economic indicators reflective of the size of the business or enterprise of the applicant, that is, asset value, sales per annum value, and number of employees. The ESC criteria were derived from the Air Pollution Fees Regulations 2014, and the regulations assumed that applications from larger ESCs may require greater effort. The EMA recognized that other jurisdictions tend to consider the quantity of waste generated to determine fees, but applicants may not have data to verify that determination. In this regard, the economic indicators were considered, but the types and quantities of waste generated would be considered in the annual waste generation fee determination. Schedule 2 provides the calculation for the annual waste generation fee, which is payable by waste generation permit holders each year. The fee payable considers the ESC of the permit holder and the types and quantities of waste generated or handled in a year. Schedule 3 provides a calculation for initial and renewal application fees for a waste handling permit and considered the ESC of the applicant as well as the types and quantities of waste handled in a year. Schedule 4 only considered the ESC criteria to determine the fee payable for a permit variation, the fees payable for a permit transfer, and an extract from the waste permit register, or standard fees payable by any person. The EMA will publish guidelines on the form of payment of fees closer to the implementation of the rules. The EMA also recognizes that implementation of the rules will generate data which could be used to inform amendments to the fees regulations, noting that the regulations was developed with limited real-time data available to the EMA. Schedule 1 considered that the processing times increased based on the assumption that the potential to generate waste or generate larger quantities of waste increased based on the ESC, where greater or larger assets may generate higher quantities of waste. However, it was noted that assets with higher values may be designed to reduce waste generation. Greater revenue may reflect productivity and increased production may result in higher quantities of waste. However, the revenue could be invested in waste reduction strategies. The higher the number of employees on the site, the greater the quantity of waste that may be generated. However, it was noted that a company may implement programs to reduce waste generation. The EMA recognized that other jurisdictions tend to consider quantity of waste generated to determine fees, but applicants may not have that data to verify the determination, especially for initial applications. In this regard, the economic indicators were considered, but the types and quantities of waste generated would be considered in the annual waste generation fee determination. The annual waste generation fee is based on the types and quantities of waste generated during a permit year and is payable by a waste generation permit holder on the anniversary date of the grant of a new or renewed waste generation permit. This fee will be implemented to sustain the compliance monitoring and enforcement and incentivize reduced waste generation. This approach to fees is common in other jurisdictions, especially the United States of America, where generators pay fees based on the types and quantities of waste generated. The regulation sets out a formula to determine the fee payable, where CM is the compliance monitoring cost. This subsidized cost varies based on the enterprise size category and considers the resources required to monitor the permitted site. HW is the sum of factors for hazardous waste generated in a permit year. A list of quantity ranges are provided, and a factor is assigned to each quantity range. The number of wastes which fall within each range is multiplied by the factor for the range, and the product of each range is added to determine the HW. Note that the factors assigned are higher than those for non-hazardous waste. NHW is the sum of factors for non-hazardous waste generated in a permit year. A list of quantity ranges are provided, and a factor is assigned to each quantity range. The number of wastes which fall within each range is multiplied by the factor for the range, and the product of each range is added to determine the NHW. The waste handling permit fee system is based on the ESC of the handler and quantities of waste handled on his site. Similar assumptions apply. Greater or more expensive assets may be used to treat hazardous waste or higher quantities of waste. However, it was noted that assets with higher values may be designed to have low operating costs and reduce waste generation. Greater revenue may indicate that a handler is operational and productive. The treatment of hazardous waste may generate a higher income. The number of employees on a site may reflect a company's capacity to maintain a workforce. However, it was noted that a company may not necessarily employ a large workforce if the technology used to handle waste does not require same. The EMA noted that other jurisdictions such as the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Australia, Scotland, Tanzania, and Zambia determine fees based on the type of waste handled, the quantity of waste handled, or the type of waste handling activity, whether recovery or disposal operations. The regulations assigned higher factors to larger quantities of waste with higher factors for hazardous waste. The fee factors allow the permit holder to vary his fee payable based on the scale of his operations, that is, the ESC, quantities, and types of waste handled. The initial application and the renewal application fees for a waste handling permit are determined using the same formula, where WHP is the waste handling permit fee calculated by the applicant or permit holder. CM is the compliance monitoring cost. The subsidized cost varies based on the enterprise size category and considers the resources required to monitor the permitted site. HWH is the factor for the total quantity of hazardous waste handled in a calendar year prior to an application. A list of quantity ranges are provided, and a factor is assigned to each quantity range. The factor selected is based on the total quantity of all hazardous waste handled or to be handled by the applicant. NHH is the factor for the total quantity of non-hazardous waste handled in a calendar year prior to an application. A list of quantity ranges are provided and a factor is assigned to each quantity range. The factor selected is based on the total quantity of all non-hazardous waste handled or to be handled by the applicant. Permit variation. The fee payable for the variation of a permit is based on the ESC of the applicant for the year in which the application for a variation was submitted. The fees were derived based on a percentage of the subsidized compliance monitoring cost for each ESC. The rules defined criteria which would require a variation and determine fees based on a percentage of the compliance monitoring cost associated with a waste handling permit and a waste generation permit. Permit transfer. A flat fee was assigned regardless of the ESC of the applicant. A flat fee is consistent with other EMA legislation. Extracts from the waste permit register. The public may inspect and may copy information published on the register upon payment of a fee. The fees payable were adopted from the Air Pollution Fees Regulations and is based on the type of extract. The regulations added a fee for electronic downloads to compensate the maintenance of an electronic register. In conclusion, the Waste Management Rules and Fees Regulations come into operation on May 31st, 2022. That is, processes under the rules start on May 31st, 2022. However, this does not prevent persons from contacting the EMA before May 31st, 2022 for guidance on the rules. Any person who intends to generate and/or handle following the commencement or is generating and/or handling waste at the time of commencement of the rules are expected to apply for the respective waste generation permit and/or waste handling permit. The rules set out activities, persons, and premises exempted from permit applications. The rules provide for permit modifications such as variation, transfer, suspension, revocation, and surrender of a permit. The rules set out requirements for a waste manifest system, packaging and labeling, annual reporting, waste permit register, record keeping, and a policy of insurance. And the fees payable by applicants and permit holders would be determined by the size of the enterprise and the types and quantities of waste generated or handled. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact us at waste@ema.co.tt or visit our website and social media pages for any updates regarding the rules and fees regulations. Thank you.
I would like to thank our viewers on Facebook as well as Twitter and Zoom. And I'd just like to let you know that this session will be aired again tomorrow on our Facebook page at 2 p.m. and it will be up for the rest of the week. So you'll have an opportunity to look at the information and the presentation and to absorb it a little bit more, because I know there was quite a bit delivered this afternoon. So before we get into the question and answer session, I would like to urge you to use the chat box, not the question and answer box, but the chat box to pose your questions. And the raised hand icon will not be enabled. So we will now begin with Giselle, who will be assisted by Trisha for the Q&A session. And please, chat box.
Thank you very much, Marcia.
Now remember, we also have that dedicated email address, emawebinars@eme.co.tt. So if you may be a little overwhelmed this afternoon by all that we've said, please do. I really encourage you to send your questions, queries, or even suggestions on the presentation to that email address. So we have Giselle on screen now, who is here to address any questions we have.
Thank you very much again, Marcia, and thank you everyone for your patience this afternoon. Let's see. I'm seeing a question, Marcia, from Sian Coffee Young. Does a generator need to apply only if the waste quantities exceed those given in the schedule? Yes, however, it should be noted that if any of the waste is deemed hazardous based on the characteristics either identified in Schedule 2, either in Table 1 or Table 2. Table 1 lists the concentrations at which something would be considered hazardous for the different parameters. And Table 2 lists the different characters. So if it's corrosive, if it's flammable, explosive, etc. And if it is deemed hazardous, then you are required to apply for any amount of hazardous waste generated. So just make a note of that. Hazardous waste in any quantity requires a permit from the EMA.
Okay, thank you, Giselle. There's another question in the Q&A box, which says it's from Glenn Goddard. Thank you for what is a comprehensive presentation so far, and I do agree it was a wonderful presentation. I would like to ask 3 questions if they don't come up later in the presentation. 1, if generators are required to use a permitted handler, how will the timing work? If generators are required to use a permitted handler, how will timing work? Second question, will EMA publish a notice of proposed action to grant a permit? Will EMA publish a notice of proposed action to grant a permit? There may be stakeholders who want to object or have input. And the third question, how will some of the municipal waste handling facilities get permitted given where they are on the journey towards ESM? Will the permit be issued with improvement conditions?
Okay, thank you very much, Glenn. And I hope I can answer all of the questions for you clearly. If a generator is required to use a permit handler, essentially, we will look at, within especially the initial time period, we will also look at the fact that handlers are supposed to have a certificate of environmental clearance. So for those generators who are utilizing handlers to accept their waste, we encourage you to utilize those persons who are already permitted through the having a CC. Of course, the handlers will be required and afforded the time frame to come into compliance as well with the requirements of the rules. In terms of the notice of the proposed action, if a permit is to be granted, no, there is no stipulation within the rules to facilitate that notice. The intention is to only issue those notices of the intended action to the applicant. However, persons can access the information through our national register. So if persons are interested in a particular entity and the process of their application, they can access the national register to view information regarding the intended action or in terms of the progress of the application. In terms of the third question, in terms of the municipal waste handling facilities that need to be permitted, in terms of the permit conditions will be tailored towards the particular entity and the particular process. So obviously the permit is valid for a period of 3 years, but it is also it also can be renewed. So based on progress made and specific actions agreed to, we will continue to work with those entities to help them come to that journey, as you say, towards environmentally sound management of the waste. So it's going to be a process with the municipal waste handling facilities. But again, through the permitting process, we hope to make those significant strides with respect to, in getting the type of environmentally sound management practices in place. I think that's it for the 3 questions.
Thank you very much, Giselle. And I'm sure if Mr. Goddard has further questions, he will definitely get in touch with you. It was remiss of me to overlook Mr. Linton Arno, whose question came before Mr. Goddard because I was looking in the chat box. My apologies, Mr. Arno. And his question is, it was mentioned that waste disposal plants do not need to apply for a waste generation permit. I suspect all disposal plants on the islands have a strict SOP to follow with separate strict guidelines. However, who monitors this? I have seen some waste disposal plants working inefficiently. I trust that the EMA is aware of these and assiduously working to rectify these concerns.
Okay, I'm going to assume that by waste disposal plants, you're referencing wastewater, wastewater treatment plants. In terms of the exemptions, wastewater itself, as in the discharge of wastewater, is not regulated under the rules. However, the activities that generate waste as part of the wastewater treatment plant will be subject to the requirements of the rules. So wastewater treatment plants, if they generate waste as part of the process, will be required to apply for and obtain a permit. However, the wastewater is regulated under the water pollution rules. So we will not be regulating wastewater as a waste stream under the rules as it is regulated elsewhere. Similarly, for facilities that have air pollution discharges, the air pollution discharges will be subject to the requirements of the air pollution rules, and the waste generated from that facility will still be required to comply with the requirements under the waste management rules. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Giselle. Just before we continue, I'd just like to reiterate that we do have a dedicated email address, and it is in the chat. It was one of the first items posted in the chat box. Not quite sure if it's still there, but it is EMA webinars with an S, one word, EMA webinars at ema.co.tt. So again, if you have any further questions that cannot be entertained during this period, we will go over a little longer than 3 o'clock, but we can't go all afternoon, obviously, because I know we all have other things going on. So please feel free to send your questions or comments to that dedicated email address. Thank you. There is a question from an attendee. Is the quantification general waste considered for waste generators? Is the quantification general waste considered for waste generators?
I'm not sure exactly what is being requested. Is the quantification general waste considered for waste generators? In terms of the waste generators, as stipulated in the legislation, Schedule 1 specifies the regulated quantities at and above which a waste generator is obligated to apply for and obtain a permit. And Schedule 1 lists a variety of categories and associated waste types and quantities. So persons who need to determine whether or not they have to apply for a permit needs to pay attention to Schedule 1 in terms of the permittable quantities for the various types of waste, as well as Schedule 2 regarding the characteristics of hazardous wastes, so that they will know whether or not they need to apply. However, we are going to be facilitating stakeholder engagement sessions starting from next week for different stakeholder groups, so that we can, help to explain a little bit more some of the requirements under the rules and facilitate additional questioning. So if I answer the question, I hope you can indicate. If not, if you can just give me a little more detail on exactly what it is you are looking for.
Sorry, does applying for a WGP supersede that of applying for a CC as a waste generator?
No, a handler who requires a CEC under the CEC rules, and usually a CEC is required where one, you are establishing a new facility, or where you intend to expand, modify, decommission, abandon your existing facility. So in terms of the existing handlers who have a CEC, we have indicated that they should apply. And in applying to the EMA, we will determine whether or not the CEC is adequate for the purposes of the waste handling operations. And if it isn't, then the waste handling permit, will be issued. So it's intended to work in tandem, where we're not trying to, have one negate the applicability of the other. So in terms of when the rules commence next year, we encourage all handlers, including those that have CECs, to apply for the waste handling permit. And in the processing of the permit, it will be determined whether or not a permit is needed, or if the CEC will be adequate for the purposes of the rules.
Thank you, Giselle. Another question from Ms. Young. Does a generator need to apply only if the waste quantities exceed those given in the schedule?
Yes. So if it is, as I said before, it's not just about Schedule 1. There's also Schedule 2 with respect to hazardous waste. If you generate hazardous waste, that is waste that meets any of the criteria in Schedule 2, in any quantity, you are required to apply for a permit. However, if your waste does not meet the criteria that will consider it hazardous, then the quantity specified, the annual permittable quantity specified in Schedule 1 is the guide to determine whether or not you need to apply. So again, if it is you're generating sewage at or above a specific quantity as specified, then you are required to evaluate your annual generated quantities. If it is, there are ways, or you find ways to modify your process to find ways to reuse or reduce the waste generated to below the annual permitted quantities, then you are no longer required to apply for and obtain the permit. So it is very important. And that's the intention of the rules themselves, to really encourage specific practices where persons not only looking at environmentally sound management, but ways in which to reduce that waste. Because if you don't want to fall within the permitting regime, then you need to look at ways in which you can revisit your process, modify your process in any way to help reduce the quantities generated. But the permittable quantities are specified in Schedule 1, and persons can take a closer look at those quantities specified. And again, just remember Schedule 2 specifies the characteristics for hazardous waste, which must be applied for in any quantity.
Thank you, Giselle, once again. Just bear with me, please, because there are some questions in the Q&A box as well as the chat box. So please forgive me if I have not yet addressed your question. I will go over to the chat box and see. I think there are a couple questions here which I have not looked at yet. Yes. Will all vehicles transporting waste internally between oil and gas lease operator blocks require a waste handling permit, or will this be covered under the waste generation permit?
So that's the thing with transporters. If the transporter's business is solely and wholly the transport of the waste, they themselves do not need to apply for the permit. However, if it is the transporter is affiliated with the waste generator or the waste handling facility, the issue related to transport, the conditions and all those requirements regarding the transport will be covered under either the waste generation permit or the waste handling permit.
Thank you again, Giselle. We are going to end at 3:15. My apologies to those of you whose questions have not been answered, but we'll just take 2 more questions. So there is one in the chat box, just to confirm, if waste generated, mostly food and packaging material, is temporarily stored by a company and removed regularly by a third party, the company is supposed to have a WGP?
Well, I'm assuming is a standard company, you're not generating waste as part of your operations. And in terms of the waste, you're looking at plastics, paper, that sort of thing. If it is, you're looking at plastics and paper, then the registrable quantities specified will apply. But if you look at the quantities, if you are generating, waste at that quantity annually, it will be considered a significant amount. Other than that, in terms of your own internal practices and processes to reduce the quantities, you can avoid having to apply for and obtain a permit based on just the generation of your paper and plastic waste from your organization.
Thank you again, Giselle. Second to last question. Some companies segregate waste in terms of plastic, cardboard, food waste, etc. However, there may be general waste bins present across a company which may contain a variety of waste types. Are waste streams from these bins expected to be considered in the quantification, or is it that waste generators that may have these types of bins may be expected to ensure adequate separation and segregation of waste?
Well, I guess this question is similar to what I just answered in terms of, again, if it is you are generating specific types of waste as part of your operations, then, so like I indicated in terms of plastics, etc., if you're generating that in the quantity specified, you may be required to apply for and obtain a permit. However, by simply implementing specific practices you should be able, and of course, it depends on the size of the organization, because as we indicated, the annual quantities are considered large. So it really just requires companies to consider, how they can currently manage their other waste that they are generating, to ensure that, if they want to avoid coming into the permitting regime, putting things in place. However, if someone is unsure regarding their particular company operations, whether or not the waste that they are thinking of would qualify them, you can send us a question, or, at the time that we start facilitating the pre-application meetings, you can call to request a meeting as needed, so that in terms of the operations and the types of waste you're generated, we can identify whether or not certain types would apply. But again, as I stated, in terms of plastics and paper, which is included in Schedule 1, companies need to look at, whether or not they really are generating the quantities at that level to warrant needing a permit for those types of waste. It should be noted, however, that for generators in general, all the different waste streams should be considered in applying for your permit. So in terms of those types of waste as well, it's recommended that you provide those quantities as well in your application for consideration, if they fall within the permittable quantities, of course.
Thank you, Giselle, once more. I will just entertain two more questions. One here is quite significant. Of course, that doesn't mean that all the other questions were not. Will the waste generated data gathered via the permitting process be made available to the public for research purposes?
Well, the data that the EMA will be collecting would be for a myriad of uses, mainly the reporting obligations, of course, but it will also be used for informing policy. We do report the quantities of waste generated, intend to, as part of our annual State of the Environment report. So the annual State of the Environment report will start including some of the metrics associated with the data collected from the waste permitting process. Other than that, just remember that the applications are posted in the National Register. So if persons are free to visit the National Register to, get the information they need where required.
Thank you. And the last question, which would segue into some of the other things I have to mention. So thank you again, Giselle, for answering those questions so comprehensively. I know it's your forte, but it has been quite a lot of work for her to put together, because remember, this legislation is new. So we'd like to congratulate Giselle and her team on a job well done. So the last question, will this presentation be sent to the participants? As we had mentioned before, we will be on Facebook tomorrow. The presentation will be on Facebook tomorrow for 2 o'clock, and it will be up for the rest of the week. It will also be linked to our YouTube channel. So you will have the presentation. It will be available for quite a long time, because on the YouTube channel, it does not come down very quickly. It usually is up for quite a number of months. And again, it will be on Facebook. We'd like to urge you to please complete the survey. It's on our Facebook page. This is a survey on the National Environmental Policy. And we'd really like to hear from you what you feel, what you think about the policy, about what should be done. And it's very important, because it is this policy that drives everything that goes on in the environmental management field, not just for the EMA, but for all other organizations. So we will be with you again next week, Tuesday, the 19th. And this knowledge series on next week, Tuesday, will be a little different. We'll be having a conversation with Mrs. Patricia Turpin, who is one of our Greenleaf Special Awards recipients. And that's this conversation, as I had mentioned before, will take place with the EME and Mrs. Turpin from her home in Tobago. So this should be very entertaining and very informative because Mrs. Turpin is a stalwart in the environmental field. She has lots of hands-on experience and a lot to share with many of you, particularly younger people who are getting into that sort of movement and would like to get more information as to how things have progressed. And of course, historically, it is so important to know what has happened in the past to address, present and future issues. So thank you again for joining us. Again, I apologize for the little technical problems we've had, but I hope you've enjoyed this, that it has been informative, and we'll see you again on Tuesday the 19th at 2 p.m. Remember to adhere to all the COVID guidelines, the 3 W's, wear your mask, wash your hands, and watch your distance. Remember, although you are fully vaccinated, it does not prevent you from contracting COVID. Your symptoms will just be less severe. So just bear that in mind, please. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you again on Tuesday.